When we think of iconic names of musicians, perhaps names like Presley, Lennon, Franklin come to mind. While some of those might seem like relics of the past, the majority of them died before I was even born. We actually need to go back further in time to one of the first rock and roll stars, that being German composer Ludwig van Beethoven. However, before we look into his story, his life, his music career, and of course his living relatives that still bear that name, we need to look at where that original name Beethoven comes from. This surname might seem pretty alien, being more or less synonymous with the wild-haired deaf composer, and of course a certain dog. The surname is actually something of an occupational surname, like Smith and Baker in English. The name comes from the word biff, which means beetroot, and hoven, which is the plural of hof, which means farm, so the name means beetroot farms. The van part of the name means of/from, but we all know that van is Dutch, with von being its German equivalent, and Beethoven was German after all. He had van as opposed to von due to the fact that his family ties do come from the Netherlands. The first name of Ludwig is pretty cool too, literally meaning famous in war, though I don't think our Ludwig was ever in any wars, though he did write some military music. However, when it comes to his life story and his rise to stardom in the world of classical music, I'm definitely going to need a helping hand from someone who is much more versed in the world of music than myself. Luckily, one of the 12 tones from the fantastic channel 12 Tone is here to lend a hand.
Hey Patrick, it's actually just me. The channel's called 12 Tone, but I'm only one person.
Oh really? I guess you could say I'm really bad with names.
How many times have you used that joke?
Too many times, 12 Tone. Too many times.
Right, I'm just gonna get into this. So Ludwig van Beethoven was a pretty big deal. In fact, I've heard many music historians effectively divide Western music into two main periods, before and after Beethoven. Of course, culture is more complicated than any single individual, and there were lots of other factors involved in the musical revolution that was the Romantic era, but it's hard to deny that Beethoven played an important role in shaping music for centuries to come. Before all that, though, he was just a boy born in 1770 to Maria and Johann van Beethoven. Johann was a court singer in the German city of Bonn, and he taught his son piano and violin from an early age. He was also a violent alcoholic, and there are stories of him dragging young Ludwig out of bed to perform for his drinking buddies and beating him when he wouldn't comply. In 1778, Beethoven gave his first public performance. He was 7.5 years old, but his father claimed he was 6 in order to further paint him as a child prodigy. However, the reception was lukewarm, possibly because of Johann's limitations as a teacher, and in 1779, Ludwig's music education was handed over to court organist Christian Gottlob Neef. Neef helped Ludwig develop as an artist, letting him fill in as organist when Neef was away. This was also when he started composing, publishing his first work, a series of variations on a march by Ernst Christoph Dressler in 1782 when he was 11 years old. Ludwig worked his way up, becoming deputy court organist and beginning to make some money of his own. As he grew, though, it became clear that Bonn wasn't big enough for him, and when he was 16, he traveled to Vienna in the hopes of meeting and performing for Mozart. It's unclear whether the two of them actually met, but what we do know is that later that year, Beethoven returned to Bonn to care for his ailing mother, who died a few months later. This drove his father even deeper into alcoholism, eventually forcing Beethoven to receive an order diverting half of Johann's salary to him so he could use it to take care of his brothers. He continued to compose during this time, and 5 years later he returned to Vienna to study with renowned composer Joseph Haydn. Soon after Beethoven left, his father died, but this time he stayed in Vienna, where he quickly became a sensation, dazzling the musical world with his piano sonatas and improvisational skill. In 1800, he debuted his first full symphony, and while it's fairly tame compared to his later works, it marked the beginning of the musical maverick he would become. Soon after, Beethoven wrote to his friend that he was beginning to lose his hearing. He lamented how unfair it was that this could happen to such a great musician, and in his despair even contemplated ending his own life. But he continued to compose, expressing increasing dissatisfaction with his early works and continuing to push the boundaries of what music could be. In 1808, he received an offer to become a music director in the German city of Kassel, but a group of Viennese aristocrats banded together, offering him an annual salary in order to stay, making Beethoven one of the first independent composers, making a living off his music without needing a patron. This arrangement allowed him even more freedom to compose as he wished, and he began to experiment further, challenging the musical conventions of the time. He was prolific, publishing numerous symphonies, but his hearing continued to worsen, and in 1815 he was forced to retire from public performance. Around this time, some of his supporters in Vienna began to encounter financial trouble and backed out of their agreement with Beethoven, and to make ends meet he was forced to take commissions, including one for a symphony from the Philharmonic Society of London in 1817. He abandoned his London trip due to illness, but that commission would go on to inspire what is considered by many to be one of the crowning achievements of Western classical music, the Ninth Symphony. This premiered in Vienna in 1824, 2 years before Beethoven's death in 1826, and it was revolutionary. It even included a choir, which may not sound like much now, but for the time it was completely unheard of. Once again, Beethoven challenged the structures of classical music, introducing new and exciting ideas for what music could be if we let go of our preconceptions. He knew his work would confuse contemporary audiences, but he also believed that later listeners would come to more fully appreciate them, and almost 200 years later, it seems safe to say that he was probably right.
Thanks 12 Tone for getting us covered in the life and music of Beethoven. Once you're done with this video, don't forget to check out a video on their channel, talking about how a certain type of material ended up sharing its name with a certain genre of music. A certain familiar face might even be making an appearance. Anyway, now we're caught up with what Beethoven achieved in his life, we need to look into what remains of his legacy, and of course, see if anyone on this planet alive today who relates to Beethoven still carries that iconic name. The logical place to look would be with the children of Beethoven himself. Well, you know the term married to the job? Well, it would seem that Ludwig was quite the epitome of that lifestyle, as he never married or had children. How on earth did a successful musician like Beethoven never build a life with anyone? It's believed that while he never got married, he was in fact madly in love with an aristocrat woman named Antonia Brentano, who was married off to a man she never loved at age 17. It's theorized that her son Karl Josef did not belong to her husband, but in fact was the love child between her and Beethoven. The son was born in 1818, never saw his supposed true father, and by the age of 4 was struck ill, which limited his movement and mental capacity. It's thought this separation from his son was the reason behind some of his darker works. Though this is all hypothesis, and as interesting as it is, his son Karl Josef didn't bear the name Beethoven, and he died childless in his 30s anyway, so even if he was his son, this leads to a dead end. A better place to look would be with the siblings of Ludwig. Ludwig's parents had 7 children. The children of Maria and Johann were Ludwig, this is our Ludwig, Caspar, Nicholas, Anna, Franz and Maria. Unfortunately, the first Ludwig, Anna, Franz and Maria all died in childhood. That leaves us with the 3 sons of Ludwig, Caspar, who was more known by his middle name of Karl, and Nicholas. Ludwig, as we know, didn't marry or have any children, and whilst the youngest surviving son Nicholas did get married, he never actually had any children either. This leaves us with just the middle son of Karl to carry on the name. And luckily for us, he did have a son with his wife Johanna Reis, who they named Karl van Beethoven. Man, Ludwig just can't get away from Karl's. Karl's father, Karl, died young, which led to Ludwig and Karl's widow taking custody for the young Karl. Too many Karls. This led to Ludwig becoming very possessive of the young boy. Karl was the only child of the Beethoven family, and Ludwig felt it was down to him to carry on his name and his music legacy. Even before his brother died, Ludwig was very protective of Karl and wanted him as his own and not to be controlled by his mother, who Ludwig wasn't a fan of. The young Karl spent a large amount of his youth in courtrooms as his mother and uncle fought over his guardianship, eventually leading to Ludwig taking full custody. When Karl was taken in by his uncle, he refused him to right to see his mother, leading Karl to live an unhappy life, disobeying his uncle and even attempting suicide multiple times. All this, as well as no talent in music, led to Karl joining the army, last seeing his uncle the year before he passed away. Karl left the army in 1832 and married a woman named Caroline Nask. They had 5 children together. These were Carolina, Marie, Ludwig, Gabriella, and Hermine. That makes 4 girls and 1 son, and despite the rocky relationship between Karl and his uncle, he still named his own son Ludwig Johann van Beethoven in full. Out of the 5 children Karl and Caroline had, all went on to be married and have children, but we're just here to look at the living relatives still bearing the name Beethoven. The fact that traditionally surnames are only passed down to male heritage means to save us some time, we don't need to look into the children of his 4 daughters. So let's look at his only son, Ludwig Johann van Beethoven. Ludwig Johann went on to get married and have 6 children, and also immigrated to America under the name Louis von Hoven due to the crimes he had been committing in his home of Vienna. Out of the 6 children we know of, it seems only his child Karl Julius Maria van Beethoven is the one of interest to us, as the rest were either female, so wouldn't carry on the name if they had children, died young, or we simply don't know of them at all. This Karl, however, died single and without any children, so the name Ludwig van Beethoven more or less died with his nephew's son, also named Ludwig Johann van Beethoven. While the name and legacy of the most famous Beethoven is now gone, his music still lives on to this day. Not bad for hits of the 18th and 19th century. Thank you to everyone who supports Name Explain on Patreon. It's all these awesome people who donate a small amount on a monthly basis that allows Name Explain to exist. If you love Name Explain, then why not help support the channel? A small amount of money goes a seriously long way. Thank you.